Okay, welcome back to Bounce Around Charleston. I have with me in my studio the Reverend Demett Jenkins, our faith-based coordinator for the International African American Museum. And I have Dr. Riggins Earl, who is a part of this documentary project, Our Faith Stories from the Church Balcony. Welcome, both of you, to Bounce Around Charleston.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for having us.
Okay, Dr. Jenkins, tell us how this coordinates with the African American Museum.
Absolutely. Thank you again. The International African American Museum, as you know, has been around for 22 years. And part of our programming at the museum is the faith-based initiatives. I'm the Director of Education and Engagement for faith-based communities. And so my role is to connect with all faith communities, houses of worship, faith-based organizations, faith-based theological education institutions, anything faith-based. And we're to, one, bring awareness that this museum is coming and the site that the museum is being built on. But primarily, we are to build relationships and establish partnerships with these faith-based organizations. So that means we need to do lectures and symposiums and conferences and musical events, whatever, educational events, anything under the faith-based umbrella. And so we had the pleasure of meeting Reverend Dr. Donald Green, who is the president of the Baptist Convention in Columbia, and Reverend Dr. Riggins Earl, who was a professor at ITC, and they were already working on a documentary for South Carolina about our faith stories from the balcony, where our ancestors sat in the balcony during worship service. And so if they were brought to this country and had their own faith and tradition, but yet sat in somebody else's faith house and having to worship the way that they worship. So what did that mean? What conflict was that for them? Because they had their own faith and their own traditions, and now somebody's inserting a way for them to worship. So we need to hear what their faith stories are about, because it was a lot of conflict because of their own and what was imposed upon them.
And Dr. Riggins Earl, we welcome you to Bounce Around Charleston and tell us about the documentary.
But it is an effort to try to better understand, as Reverend Demett pointed out, not only who colonial American Protestant worshipers were in these gorgeous or iconic colonial churches in Charleston, South Carolina, that are also a part of the American narrative. These churches are not limited to Charleston. What took place in these churches and what took place in Charleston helped to make America for better and for worse. And that's the great contradiction. Your city is called the city of churches. It's almost, I guess you could probably call it symbolically a Protestant Vatican. And at the same time, it has to bear the burden of a history that is hard for many people, some people to believe, and it's hard to understand because we have said so little about it and we're so reticent to talk about it. But it has to be talked about because the people, the Black people who helped to make this country were shaped by those churches and what happened in those balconies. Because it was in those balconies that we were brought into another religion that we knew nothing about. And so we were not just sold into slavery and brought to this country, but we were brought to another deity. And a lot of people don't talk about it that way, but this is what we are facing when we face the past history in this country and in the Western world. And in that in that narrative of being forced to worship out of the balconies of those churches, the people who built those had slaves to build those churches and worship in them. They told them that we are doing you a favor by letting you worship up there in the balconies because we can bring you to Jesus. And by bringing you to Jesus, we'll civilize you and save you.
So the balcony, so you're telling me that the balcony had a purpose pretty much of saying separation.
Oh, of course. It was the same purpose that the deck on the ship had. You put the slaves in the bottom of the ship to control them, and the deck was for those who mastered the ship. In the balcony, slave masters did not sit in the balcony. They sat on the main level, on the main floor of the church, and they were preached to by the preacher and told to be good masters and control your slaves. And the slaves were preached to the white preachers preached to them and told them, obey your masters because it will get you, it's a passport to heaven.
And how do you all feel? How has this impacted our churches today?
How do I feel about it?
Yes, sir. How has it impacted our churches today?
It's a painful feeling because it speaks volumes about where we are in this country today in race relations. I mean, if the church couldn't get this right, then how it's ironic that we have, that even their political officials who will say, but you know, America is a Christian nation. But if this is Christianity, if this is America's version of Christianity, then it means that we started off on the wrong foot and we haven't gotten back on it yet. And if we're not willing, I don't care how many documentaries we make, if we're not willing to have informed discussions about the documentaries and what happened in the American narrative, then we are not willing to try to straighten it out. It seems to me that when President Obama came to Charleston to do in that tragic moment to do the eulogy of those people who were slaughtered in the church, that if somebody in his administration had been astute enough to say, or even somebody in the white community of Charleston had been courageous enough to say, well, let's have a public forum, let the White House put on a public forum about what happened in Charleston, even in the churches, and how it started off with the slaves in the balcony and the masters on the main floor.
Do you think that if many of our churches knew the history behind the balcony, because apparently there is a story about the balconies, and if many of our churches knew the history behind balconies and churches, would they today continue to put balconies in our churches?
Well, that's a good question, and maybe some would not, because it doesn't have a good history. It does. I think the history could be redeemed by facing it and admitting that this once happened, and we don't want it to ever happen again, even if it's not predicated on race, even if it's predicated on class. Because in some of our churches, even in Black churches, the balcony was for those people who felt marginal to the church worship. So they in some churches, we had to close the balcony off until there was an overflow downstairs. And then we let people go upstairs. But there were people who would come late because they didn't want to sit down among the so-called elite.
I think balcony conversations in general need to be had for our people, because we, even in movie theaters, we tend to go straight to the balcony and not to the front. So there's something embedded in us to make us think that that's where we belong. And so we got to have balcony conversations across the board. But particularly for our faith communities, because that's where our energy, our strength, our courage, and all, we go to our churches for those reasons. And so, I think it's important that we have to teach our history. We're at the museum, we're trying to share all of our history, and some of it is very tough to hear and very hard to, absorb. But we also know that it's the truth. And so we're not telling an untruth, we're telling the truth. And so sometimes we have to hear the truth in order to know, to grow, and to, be wise about who we are as a people, who we are as a culture, and how we represent ourselves in the world. And so we have to know our history. And so these faith stories that come out of that balcony, I would love to hear from some of the elders who are still living and have their cognition, who are in their 80s and 90s, what some of their stories are.
Well, Reverend Jenkins and Dr. Earl, we will be bringing you all back. And we must do that because the documentary isn't ready yet.
Yes.
But there is a panel discussion to be had, and we will be bringing you all back. But Dr. Jenkins, I need you to give us time, place.
So this panel discussion will take place on Tuesday, March 22nd of 2022 at 6:30 p.m. at Second Presbyterian Church, downtown Charleston. And so you can watch it online virtually, and we have a registration for that. Or you can come in person to Second Presbyterian Church and be present while this discussion is happening.
Okay, Reverend Jenkins and Dr. Earl, we want to say thank you for being on Bounce Around Charleston, and we look forward to bringing you all back so we can complete this documentary, because I too believe that there is a story from the balcony.
Amen. Amen.